Our first project is to do a branch without leaves. The first thing you want to do is measure for the real estate. So here you can see I've drawn a rectangle which fits this area from here to here. And although it looks larger on your screen, it is because it is in perspective and this branch is a certain distance away from the rectangle, which is measured in true dimension. I need to add a few more things onto here before I draw. So I'm going to measure the distance of this light area just so I know that this is where it's going to go. And I'm going to measure the distance of the lateral branch outcrop, which is going to go somewhere in this area here, based on the fact that I'm going to also measure this distance, so that's just about right. So I know those are the areas where I have very distinct changes in the form, and the rest of it is pretty much the same. Now this distance accounts for this height over here and this base over here. So this, if you look at this branch, it really is at a slight angle. So when I'm going to draw this, I'm going to draw it at a slight angle within the framework of this geometric form. I've laid another sheet of tracing paper over the top of the real estate that I've drawn, and I'm going to check the angle of this branch, which is going to be like this slight angle, and the back of it comes down to the base, and this area up here is the peak of this object, and then we have this irregular form that is at the base of this. We're going to put in a very quick gesture, and then we're going to add some basic structural changes. Now I am going to draw beyond this just to fade it out and so that it has some continuity rather than just breaking it off at that one particular end. And what I'm going to do at this end is just fade it out because I don't particularly like what's going on here and I don't really want it in the drawing. So that is our first step. And at this point, you can start to just put in a few more basic forms that define the structure of this branch. Now the next thing I'm going to do, now that I have this, I'm going to lay another piece of tracing paper on top of this, and I'm going to start to draw in the fine details. So you really need to look at things. It's like really look at what kinds of shapes are going on here, what's happening here, and you might need a magnifying glass. Look at the contour, how the bark on this branch changes. Then you can look at what is happening with this detail. It looks like there's a split here in the bark, so you want to add that. And then we've got lichen shapes here. And you can just basically outline these lichen shapes. You do have to be very accurate about the shape of that lichen shape. And then we have this branch outcrop here. And what does this thing do? How does it really look? Don't guess or leave anything undefined. I'm going to lay this sketch under another sheet of tracing paper, and then I'm going to work to do the fine definition, and the underlying structure will be there as a guide for what proportions everything has to be. This is the third step in the drawing process for this piece of wood, and as you can see, there's a lot more detail information, so that now I am ready to go to my good drawing paper. This final line drawing is now completely transferred onto good paper, and it's very, very lightly indicated using my transfer sheet that I've put carbon on. I normally leave this overlay right on the drawing paper so that if I lose something, I can always go back and I can add it again in the process of the rendering. So let's take a look at this specimen and see what it does. You can see that there is quite a bit of difference in values between the light areas and the dark areas. We have a section here that has a lot of bark and lichen. Within the bark itself, we see light patches of lichen. Then we have this section here, which is an adjunct branch. Then you have this shredded off end, and each one of these has very distinct values. If we squint at it, what it does is it takes out all of the minor details. Like you don't really see the lichen, you don't see the shredded portions of the wood, you just see a light area. And here on the bark, you just see a dark area for the most part. And here where we have a cone shape, you can see that the highlight is in this area, and then it gets darker as it goes away, and you might even see some cast shadows. So how do we approach this? Because this is fairly complex in terms of detail. For you to be realistic, you must put in all this detail, and you must put it in accurately. You cannot just create a shape and say, oh, that's lichen. No, because it isn't. You'll notice that some of these shapes are very intricate. Those are important to replicate as they are. But let's begin simply. We work from simple to complex. So the first thing we're going to do is tone in the major areas. First of all, to define the form. So this is a round form. It is a cylinder. That means regardless of what you're seeing in terms of detail here, you're going to have shadow that goes away from the light on this side, and you're going to have shadow that goes away from the light on this side. Now we are getting a little bit of reflected light along this end, but it's my feeling that what you should do is shade for the form first. So we're going to shade for this cylinder, ignoring all of the details. And I say that because even though we have lichen that are light, as they go back around away from the highlight area, they too, even though they're light, will get darker. So the first thing we want to do is distinguish the major darks and lights. So we have a very light area here. We have a dark area here. We have a medium light area here and kind of a medium light area here where this is going to fade off. That is the first step that you want to do when you start to render this subject. Render for form first. The first step to tone this is to start with the darks. So since this is my major area of interest, this is the area that I have toned in. And I just used a number 5 pencil and put a very light shade of value in here. I didn't want it to go too dark at this point, but now I'm going to start to shade for the roundness of this subject. So keeping in mind that this area here, regardless of what's in there in terms of detail, is still going to be my highlight area. I will start by putting in a dark shadow all across the top, and then another one across the bottom. Our darker shadow will be on the bottom side of this object, and the highlight will be up from center. So that means I'm going to put some darks down in here. Bring this little strip of bark over to the main area that's dark. And bring my shadow up to the highlight, feathering it to the light area. Now this will take several layers of value because we do want it to be relatively dark so that when we tone this in, we will have a nice contrast between the light and the dark areas. And you can see, we can still see through the shading that I'm putting in right now. We can still see through to the textured aspects of this branch. I'm totally ignoring all of the detail on the bark at this point and just rendering for the form of the object before I do anything else. At this point, I have 2 layers, maybe 3 layers of number 5 graphite on this branch, and I have toned it just as though it were a cylinder. So we have a highlight along this end because the light is coming more or less from the top down at 11 o'clock. And now I'm going to go in with a 4H pencil, and I'm going to darken even more, especially down here in this lower part of the branch where the light is the least strong. It still needs to be made more round before we get to putting in the details. So I'm going to put a second layer of shadow down here where we have coarse shadow, not going all the way to the edge, so that it creates some reflective light on the underside of this structure. And I will do this all the way across the bottom, blending it up into the lighter area, but I'm leaving just that bottom area, feathering it where necessary, just to create a little bit of reflected light. So now I'm going to start looking for those areas that are light areas. And I'm going to darken around those areas even more and carry that information into the rest of the branch. And just by doing that, you can start to see how the lichen are going to start to show up. Now they're also, if we look at the specimen again, you can see how dark it is. But we'll get to that point as we go along. I'm still working with the 4H pencil, and when I do these areas around the lichen, I definitely do the rest of the area as well. And you can almost, with a very light line, outline your lichen and then blend that line into the area around it so that it doesn't look like an outline any longer. And by putting in some of the darker details where you see dark shadows, it will also help you to define where to put values. But you will have this underlying structure from which to work and to help you to see where things have to go. Now I'm going to switch to a 3H pencil for some of these darker areas. And I may go even to a 2H at some point. So you can see as I'm working and adding darks around the lichen, when it was developed this way, you can see how light they've become once we start to add further darks into the area, and yet they will still have a sense of that roundness that we established when we first did the structural form for this specimen. And even up here, where I have some darks, I have some lichen up in there, but because they were in that dark area, they still remain dark and yet are read as lighter lichen that are the same kind of thing as what we have in the lighter area. So that's the way that you work this until you have the entire structure of this branch completed.